Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn blog as we head back into another article by Lars Lih. This one's also from 2013. Democratic Centralism, Further Fortunes of a Formula. It's from issue 972 of the Weekly Worker. And I did find the Weekly Worker for this one. So let's get straight to it. While the emphasis inevitably shifted according to the circumstances, right, Lars Lih, for the Bolsheviks, democracy was just as vital as centralism. A couple of months ago, I wrote an essay entitled Fortunes of a Formula, in which I presented some new documentary material that threw a surprising light on the famous formula of democratic centralism. Asterisk, in the Russian context, we still got to deal with the German context. We'll come back to that in other documents. Material from Lenin's writings and from the Bolshevik activist and party historian Vladimir Nevsky made it clear that democratic centralism was not a defining feature of Bolshevism. No, it was not unique to it for sure and wasn't in play most of the time. In fact, the formula is part of a party lexicon in only two sharply distinct periods, in 1906 and 1907, when the political conditions were more free in Tsarist Russia than ever before or since, and after 1920, when the Bolsheviks were faced with the unforeseen task of administrating a large country, asterisk, in the context of a civil war, and finishing off a terror and a bunch of other things. Back to the text. Furthermore, the phrase democratic centralism meant entirely different things in the two periods. In 1906 to 1907, the emphasis was on democratic, and the concrete meaning of the term was genuine election of leadership bodies and wide open discussions of party issues. From 1920 on, the emphasis was strongly on centralism deemed necessary and a party responsible for running the Soviet state, asterisk again, in the context of a civil war. Almost immediately after publishing this essay, I came across two further documents, one written in 1909 and the other in 1923, that throw further eloquent light on the issue of democratic centralism as a Bolshevik value. Much to my relief, they corroborated my essential points made in my essay. They show even more strongly that democratic centralism was tied to specific conditions rather than put forward as a general principle, and accordingly, it meant very different things in the two periods. It was interesting that I felt the need to resort to the same phraseology twice, and I would like Lih to talk about that a little bit. All right, anyway. The two documents presented also help us put the democratic centralism in the context of the more basic Bolshevik organizational norms. In the 1909 document, uses the term partinos, or partiness, to sum up the basic Bolshevik approach. The 1923 document makes it clear that workers' democracy was a more fundamental goal, at least in aspiration, than democratic centralism. That's interesting. Some Trotskyists make that claim as well. That makes both MLs and Bordagists really mad. All right. The earlier document from 1909 is the platform of the dissent Bolshevik group, Vepred Forward. Vepred, I have no idea how to pronounce that. The platform was penned by Alexander Bogdanov, the leader and ideological mentor of Vepred. Naturally enough, most writers are exclusively interested in the differences between Bogdanov and Lenin, a topic to which whole books have been devoted. Yep, and they're interesting, by the way. But Bogdanov's platform is also invaluable because of its description contained in the earlier section of the 40-page platform of the essence of Bolshevism. That is, the consensus to which all Bolsheviks might subscribe. In his polemical response to this platform, Lenin did not deny the accuracy of Bogdanov's rendition of the ABCs of Bolshevism, the 1918 platform, when combined with the 1920 21 points. Anyway, the excerpts translated below are taken from these meant to be uncontroversial sections. Recall that our aim is to find out what democratic centralism was in the Bolshevik outlook, as opposed to the SPD outlook. And we'll get back to that later. I believe that Lenin would endorse most of what Bogdanov says in the translated excerpts. But even if we decide that Lenin rejected the values put forth in these excerpts, we can be sure that one group of Bolsheviks, the Vepred group itself, believed in them. More, the group was confident that the Bolshevik faction as a whole would subscribe to them. The second of my two documents comes from a Pravda article written by Grigory Zinoviev, my least favorite Bolshevik, on the occasion of the anniversary of the October Revolution in November 1923. Zinoviev discussed various problems facing party life, one of which was the insufficient democracy within the party, leading to the alienation of the rank and file and lack of creative responses to new challenges. Zinoviev's style is one that we can often find in his speeches and writing. A frank admission that things are not satisfactory, a mitigating plea that objective conditions are responsible, and a pledge to do better, especially as objective constraints relax their grip. Fair enough, Zinoviev. Although this is the beginning of how Zinoviev ends up in the left opposition. This is important to note. Okay, let's get back to the text. Only after translating these documents did I see another continuity between them. Both Bogdanov and Zinoviev talk about the dangers of a mutual alienation growing up between the top rungs of the party and the lower rungs. Both use the same vocabulary of verhi versus nitzi, I hope, which might be translated as hierarchy versus lowerarchy. Oh, that's okay. Fun. I do love new words. All right. In the fall of 1920, the problem of a split between the Verki and the Nitsi became a subject of widespread debate and discussion within the party. Or 1920. Excuse me, I said 21. It's 1920. That's interesting that it's that early and it's right before the Civil War. After the introduction of the new economic policy, good old NEP, a dissident group called the Rabochaya Pravda, the Workers' Truth, put forward the same concerns. In his 1923 Pravda article, Zinoviev does not hide the fact he is trying to steal the thunder of the Rabochaya Pravda by showing the official party leadership was sensitive to the mutual alienation, separating the people at the top rungs from the people in the bottom rungs of the party. These two documents show the Bolsheviks talking to other Bolsheviks, and of course, Bogdanov and Zinoviev want to make specific and potentially controversial points, but in each case, their argument starts by making appeals to a common consensual Bolshevik values. As shown by the excerpts I have translated and appended to these remarks, their comments on democratic centralism come from the non-controversial part of their statements. Their points on the topic are made in passing, with no expectation that anyone would or could disagree. Interesting. Possibly a new alertness to the topic of democratic centralism was responsible for my running across these documents so soon. Perhaps these things are sent to us with a purpose. Perhaps Providence is telling me that these documents should be published as soon as possible. Providence sounds an awful lot like God, Lars Lih, but anyway. In any event, I have translated the relevant sections and prefaced them with a short explanation. Bogdanov in 1909. Bogdanov wrote that the Vepred platform in 1909 as a manifesto of a newly formed Bolshevik group. The controversies between this group and the more established Lenin group are not the issue here. The important fact for us is Bogdanov's effort in the early parts of the platform, prior to making specific suggestions for the reforms of the party life, to make statements of the general Bolshevik principles to which all Bolsheviks might subscribe. And this is before faction ban, so makes sense. Bogdanov's statements of principles has three sections. The first section, translated here, is about organizational principles. The second section presents, which I have elsewhere called the old Bolshevik scenario, that is, the revolutionary strategy that called for class leadership by the socialist proletariat of the democratic peasantry. This section is a terse and telling statement of the basic Bolshevik principles. The third section goes into the territory, more particular to the Veprod faction, namely proletarian values versus bourgeois values. Yeah, the proletariat issues. Bogdanov starts off by stating that Bolshevism has no principles particular to itself. It is simply scientific socialism as applied to Russian conditions. This is undoubtedly Lenin's opinion as well. Bogdanov's further discussion is closely tied to the Russian developments. This feature poses a problem for the translator. Bogdanov sets up a crucial opposition between partynos, partyness, and Kroshkovshina. Ugh, I don't even know what that is. And I have chosen to keep these terms in Russian since English translations say circleism is hardly more informative for the unprepared reader. Partynos can be rendered as party principled, or thinking in terms of the party, our concern for the party as a functional institution. It reads, earlier Lih had translated it as partyness. During the Soviet period, the term acquired quite different overtones. Khrushchevchina derived from the word Kroskov, which can be literally rendered as little circle. That makes sense. The very first underground social democratic organizations that arose in the 1890s consisted of these little circles. The fact that these Kroski was that they were not part of any larger organization. That leaderless resistance stuff. Because, of course, there has yet to exist no larger organization for them to be part of. Thus, the Kroskovchina can be defined as the unfortunate and destructive habits of Kroski life that manifest themselves after the National Party organization has been created. Oh, man, that's consecrated. So, basically, you're used to acting like you're a terrorist cell or a secret cell, and you still have that structure. Now, I've criticized certain Marxist groups for maintaining that structure, actually, before. Anyway, Bogdanov then goes on to narrate in an elusive fashion the conflict in the party in 1903 and 1904, after the Second Party Congress came up with a party program and established what were meant to be a generally recognized party authorities. His account confirms my own analysis in Lenin Rediscovered, which is not too surprising, given that I heavily relied on Bogdanov's own writings from 1903 to 1904. One very important point about this episode in Party Life should be stressed. When we think of debates about centralism, we usually picture insistence that the local committees blindly follow the orders handed down from above. We assume that the centralizers are leery of too much free discussion. In the episode described by Bogdanov from 1904 to 1903 to 1904, the opposite is the case. What upset the Bolsheviks during this period was not that the party committee and Poldonsk was not towing the party line. In his account, Bogdanov does not fill in the blanks with a proper names of the carriers of Kroshkovshina, but if he did, they would be Martov, Axelrod, Trotsky, and Plekhanov. So most of the Mensheviks. Remember that Trotsky had been in Michigan, who joined them for a while. Plekhanov, like the founder of Russian Marxism. Trotsky's Trotsky. Axelrod and Martov is the guy who critiqued Lenin. And I tend to be pretty sympathetic to Martov, actually. He was one of the Mensheviks who was loyal to the Bolsheviks after 1917, etc., etc., etc. It is the stellar luminaries of the party who are the rebels. The intellectual emigre who refuse to work within the institution set up by the Second Congress, who think they have an inherent right to leadership positions because they've been developing theoretically abroad, and they have been the theoretical leaders and developed separately in emigre coteries. We have to remember that about the leaders of the Bolsheviks. A lot of them were emigres, and we're not in Russia during a lot of the time period we're talking about. They are the ones who try to prohibit free discussion, for example, by banning agitation for a third Congress. Bogdanov ends this episode by claiming that the Bolshevik concept of partinos was finally accepted by the party as a whole as a binding organizational norm. I came to the same conclusion in Lenin Rediscovered. That's the book on what is to be done. Probably the best book on what is to be done. I mean, I have my criticisms of Lars Lih. I disagree with some of his readings, for example, of the Critique of the Goethe program, but he's a damn good historian. There's no question about that. He then goes on to make other claims for basic Bolshevik principles that certainly sound curious in modern ears. Moving towards an elected leadership as soon as possible. What? Not self-perpetuating elites. Working for a larger party unity. What? Not hard-boiled splitting tactics. Encouraging a variety of ideological tendencies. What? Not striving for a monolithic party line. That's all post-1920 stuff, guys. Bogdanov sets forth familiar opposition between the spontaneity and consciousness, or stinkhisnos versus purposiveness. But he seems to be unaware that this opposition entails the domination of party life by intellectuals, as we are so often assured by modern writers. In fact, he evidently feels that it entails the opposite. I've translated a few revealing paragraphs from the later sections of the platform in which Bogdanov describes the generally acknowledged party problems. I have not translated any of Bogdanov's positive suggestions, since these are not germane to our present investigation. Note that the discussion of democratic centralism is not in the section outlining basic Bolshevik principles. Bogdanov's remarks give a strong confirmation to the account in Nevsky's party history that democratic centralism was a set of practices that were possible only given certain relaxation and police repression. Quote, democratic centralism in the period of 1906-1907 means democratic centralism with open and frequent worker assemblies clothed with real powers behind the norm. As police pressure tightened after 1908, this kind of democratic centralism perforce shriveled up. Zinoviev in 1923. Zinoviev's article, The New Task of the Party, appeared in Pravda in the late 1923, a time when it was becoming increasingly clear that the Lenin era was drawing to a close and that the Bolsheviks had to reaffirm or modify basic principles for the future. His remarks can be paraphrased as follows. We all want to increase workers' democracy, Rabolchia Demokratia, within the party. Of course, there are objective obstacles to the full implementation of this principle. We now live according to the principle of democratic centralism, Zinoviev's emphasis. A party that administers a country such as Soviet Russia has to be centralized. Furthermore, within the party, there is a large gap in the cultural level between the leaders and the mass membership, that is, in basic literacy, basic grounding in Marxism, specialized competence. The best party workers are engulfed on party orders in the affairs of state and economic administration. The comrades left behind to attend exclusively to party work are not exactly top drawer. As a result, centralism in practice means today that decisions about all current issues are taken up from the top and come to the mass membership in a ready-made and unalterable form. Naturally, this is an unsatisfactory state of affairs. We may have to live with it for the present, but we need to leave it behind as quickly as possible. Our ultimate goal is free and open discussion by all party members in a way that it will allow us to apply collective experience of the party to the pressing problems of the day. So argues Zinoviev. Just more or less seems like a long quote. There's a current opinion today that likes to blame the over-centralization of party organizations on something called Zinovievism. I mean, to be fair, sometimes I even do that. Zinoviev's own presentation of his take on proper party organizational forms showed that the story, as usual, is more complicated. Okay, so these are the translated documents. Bogdanov's Veper platform. Source, NS Antonova and NK Dasdova, editors, Nevestny, Bogdanov, 3 volumes, Moscow, 1995. Era, blah, 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 blah. You can see it if you're watching. We understand that Bolshevism is the strictest and most consistent application of the ideas of scientific socialism to Russian realities. Bolshevism first appeared on the scene in a period when the organizational construction of our party was going through its first and most difficult stages. This construction was a very challenging affair, not only because it was carried out in the underground, but for other internal reasons. The party was created by uniting previously scattered and isolated Krochki circles that carried out artisan-level kuchtarnia work in localities, but the habits of the Krotok stubbornly refused to die and continued to interfere with the consolidation of the party. All the more because at the time there was the predominance of intellectual elements over the proletarian ones in the personnel of these organizations. By their very nature, these intellectual elements experienced difficulties in submitting to organizational discipline and were less capable of close party unity. And when the party program was worked out in 1903, and when by this means a strong bias for general party life was laid, the same Krotsky had led to the task of organizational unity, especially the immigrant Krotsky, revealed on one hand a disinclination to dissolve into the overall life of the newly established whole, and on the other hand, a striving to retain for themselves the same leadership status in the future. In this way, the party was threatened by the domination of Khrushchevchina in a new guise, with its most authoritative voices in the party energetically supporting it. It was then that Bolshevism stepped forward with its organizational slogans. It demanded that the interest of the cause should be put to higher than any authorities, that Partinos should be placed higher than Trotsky relations, and also that the Russian section of the party should receive a predominantly influence over the other sections outside the borders. That's going to become a problem later, but I get why it's important here. They're talking about immigrants, but we'll talk about the Russia first stuff later on. Bolshevism had to fight a long struggle for these organizational ideas. Nevertheless, even if it had not been fully incorporated in the actual life of the party still today, they are, formally at least, recognized now by everybody. When the Bolsheviks insisted on Partinos as against the Khrushchevchina, they certainly did not understand Partinos simply as a discipline and subordination duly constituted party centers, but mainly as making a broad and organization-wide decisions about all issues of party life. Naturally, as soon as the possibility opened up of moving the establishment of the party organizations themselves away from the previous closed forms of the underground to more democratic forms, Bolshevism immediately made the move. In 1905, the Bolsheviks were the first to call an all-Russian conference in which a significant majority of delegates were elected directly by organized workers. And so much as they were defenders of Partinos, Bolshevism at all times also took the lead in gathering in of the party. The Bolsheviks carried out unification with various national organizations, and they have always supported the unity of party work. Another important aspect of the organizational question was an object of internal structure within our party. Should the basis of the party be purposive or conscious, advanced elements of the fighting proletariat, or, for the sake of the broader development, should we construct the party directly out of the stinkini, or spontaneous mass workers' movement? The supporters of the second possibility believe that we should adapt the organization as a whole to the aspirations and understanding of the proletarian masses, that even the party program should be worked out at a general worker congress, etc., which is something I actually believe. Bolshevism opposed such views. It believes that subordinating social democracy to the moods of the proletarian mass, that it's just entering the struggle is incorrect and unreasonable. Bolsheviks claim that social democracy is, first of all, the party of the purposive revolutionary proletariat, one that relies on the whole experience of international socialism. Social democracy should raise the worker masses up from the Stiansny movement to the level of higher social purposiveness, not lower its own organization and tasks to the Stiansny movement. So don't be a tailist. That's what he's saying. This and no other is what strict scientific socialism means for us, since it aspires to organize the workers' movement in its higher forms and lead the movement with its highest possible level of planned forethought attainable under the circumstances. Organizational questions. Since 1906, our party has been built upon the principle of democratic centralism. That is, the leading collectives, starting with the factory committees and ending with the central committee, are elected by assemblies of organized workers. Since we find this principle to be completely correct, we think that it should be carried out in the future as widely as possible. Since 1907, however, when the reaction became dominant in the country, the implementation of democratic centralism has lost momentum. Police repression and the use of provocateurs has created enormous difficulties in setting up assemblies of organized workers of any size at all. So, for example, city committees have begun to keep up their membership, not by elections by the members at open conferences, but by election by district committees, and sometimes even by way of co-option. Thanks to all this, the ties between the lower levels of the organization with the higher levels, the Nimsky versus Verkhy, have been weakened, where the lower levels are cut off from general party life and the higher levels are extraordinarily weakened, as we all know. Various ideological tendencies exist in any strong and viable party, and they are the guarantee of its growth and development. They find their expression in the specific publication, literally in literary groups, and in freely created associations of fellow thinkers at congresses, conferences, etc. But in our party today, they have taken on another and completely abnormal form, parties within the party, a situation that destroys the general unity of our work. Kind of like the caucuses as sectarian formations within the DSA. Anyway, indeed, under the present circumstances, they interfere with the free development of even ideological tendencies themselves. This state of affairs came about due to the fact that in our case, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, as distinct factions, arose on the ground of an organizational split in 1903-1904. The split was completed even before the ideological distinction of the two sides became fully defined. That's interesting. The factions became fortified in separate organizations that the party to this day have not been able to dissolve into themselves. And then next event, Zinoviev, New Task of the Party, Source Pravda, November 7th, 1923. So this is Zinoviev's work. In our internal party life, we lately undoubtedly seem to be becalmed, and outright stagnation can be observed in places. If we wish to carry out the task discussed earlier, even in a minimally satisfactory way, or to show ourselves capable of responding to those international events that grab all of our attention at present, we must see to it that the internal life of the party become more intensive. We must see to it that the worker democracy inside the party about which we talk so much takes on to an even greater extent real flesh and blood. Our main misfortune is that often practically all the most important issues come to us from the top to the bottom already decided. This narrows the creativity of the whole mass of the party members and diminishes the independent activity samdiadnos of the lower Nitsi party cells. To a large extent, of course, this is inevitable. Our party is based on the principle of democratic centralism. Given that it administers a country such as ours, the Russian Communist Party cannot help being organized in a strictly centralized way. But to a very significant extent, this fact is explained by the way the cultural political level of the whole mass of party members lags so very strongly behind the level of its leadership strata. Many of our best party officials at the behest of the party are completely occupied with economic and administrative work, and so have no or very little possibility of plunging into mass party work alongside the right strata of the workers. Some comrades who are posted exclusively to party work are not always able to respond adequately to the new and huge demands on them that result from the growing exigencies of the masses. The party must devote all attention to these tasks, ones that have a predominant significance at present. Without indulging in superfluous bombast about the sanctity of the principle of workers' democracy, it is imperative that workers' democracy should actually be a pride within the party, that free discussion within the party on general political, economic, and other issues be intensified. In particular, we must draw the attention of the rank and file members of our party to the burning questions of industrial life. The writer of these lines is fully aware of the fact that the present article has only put forth these questions without solving them. A general solution of these questions will come about only as a result of an exchange of opinions within our party. By summing up the collective experience of our party, we will discover those new practical measures that will lead us to our goal. End of work. So we see here that democratic centralism kind of oscillated between the focus on democracy or centralism, depending on the time, but they were trying to get it back, at least Zinoviev and people around him, to a more democratic response, because they saw the high centralization and top-down nature basically to be a function of consolidating the state, ending the Civil War, ending the Red Terror, etc. For those of you who don't know, the Red Terror is not the purges of the Yezhovchina, and it's important to keep those two things separate. Anyway, check out these articles. Weekly Worker is a good source of historical notes, and I think we can see that as we explore the way democratic centralism has been used, and I started this with a discussion of a Canadian complaint by Maoists about democratic centralism back in the day, that this becomes a weirder and weirder point within these groups. But it isn't unique to Bolshevism, and Lars Lih is absolutely right about that. All right, if you want more like this, like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's a lot more behind the Patreon. I have discussions of entire history books back there. So if you want to come, you can find us behind the Patreon. You can get access to audio behind the Patreon for as little as $4 a month. And there's thousands and thousands of hours back there. There's over almost 2,000 posts. So have a great day. Hit the bell if you're interested, like and subscribe, and protect your peace because it's important as we educate ourselves. Take care.